Hello again. In this lesson, we'll focus on relative clauses and we'll see specifically how in level C1 we can use non-defining relative clauses to add detail and complexity to our discourse. Let's begin by seeing the way in which relative clauses can help us to provide more information about someone or something. In other words, a relative clause can be useful because by means of it we can combine two sentences without repeating information. Let's look at this example. Sentence number 1, a felony is a serious crime. Sentence number 2, a felony can be punished by 1 or more years in prison. Now we can combine these two sentences by means of a relative clause, and then we can have a felony is a serious crime that can be punished by 1 or more years in prison. So if you see, we have a sentence here with a relative clause that helps us to combine the two elements of the two sentences. Now, there are two kinds of relative clauses. Let's begin by defining relative clauses. Defining relative clauses help us, as the name suggests, to define the subject. So we cannot remove them because then the sentence will be incomplete. Here's one example. A judge is a person who is in charge of a trial in a court and decides how a person who is guilty of a crime should be punished. If we eliminate the whole relative clause who is in charge of a trial and all of the rest, we are left with an incomplete sentence, right? In other words, we don't have a clear definition of the subject. Same thing happens with a felony is a serious crime that can be punished by 1 or more years in prison. We have, in this case, again, a relative clause that is helping us to define the way in which a felony can be punished. So if we eliminate the relative clause, we are left with incomplete information. Let's look at some other examples by looking at definitions of legal terms such as handcuffs and prison and pedophile and prosecutor and probation and court. In all of these examples, we will see the way in which defining relative clauses help us to provide important information about the subject. For example, when we define handcuffs as two metal plastic rings joined by a short chain that lock around a prisoner's wrist. A prison is a building where criminals are forced to live as punishment for their crimes. A pedophile is someone who is sexually interested in children. A prosecutor is a public official who institutes legal proceedings against someone. Probation is a period of time when a criminal must behave well and not commit any more crimes in order to avoid being sent to prison. And finally, a court is a place where trials and other legal cases happen. So we can see here, with these definitions, the importance of defining relative clauses. They help us to define the subject. The second kind of relative clauses are non-defining relative clauses. Now these ones only help us to provide additional information about the subject. In other words, they work only as parenthetical remarks. They help us to add detail, to add additional information and elaborate on our ideas. For example, in sentence A, in many countries, tax evasion is simply a misdemeanor. We have a complete idea. This is a complete sentence. Now we can add more detail about this idea by saying in many countries, tax evasion, which is very common among the rich and the famous, is simply a misdemeanor. In this case, we can see that our relative clause is just adding some more information, but if we eliminate, we still have a complete sentence. Another example will be common criminals usually become recidivists. Now, if I want to provide more information about this, why recidivism happens, I can include this information in a non-defining relative clause. For example, common criminals, many of whom are arrested and then released because of lack of proof, usually become recidivists. We can see here that the purpose of using a non-defining relative clause is simply to add detail and make my discourse more complex, more sophisticated. Some of the relatives that we can use in non-defining relative clauses are the following: none of whom, few of whom, many of whom, all of whom. We can also use none of which, some of which, many of which, or all of which. Now, what's the difference between defining and non-defining relative clauses? Let's compare these two pairs of sentences. In the first case, the students who never studied will fail the course. We can see that the meaning is that only the students who never studied will fail. However, in sentence number 2, when we say the students who never studied will fail the course, we are saying that all of the students will fail. So if you see, the first example is a defining relative clause, because the clause who never studied is defining the subject, the students, whereas in the other case, the sentence is the students will fail the course, and the relative clause is only adding additional information to the main sentence. In other words, this is a non-defining relative clause. The same happens in the other two examples. When we say the students bought a book that was useless, we are saying that the book was useless. That was useless is defining the subject book. However, when we say the students bought a book which was useless, we are saying that it was useless or unnecessary to buy the book. So we can see here with these two examples how we can change meaning, or how a defining and non-defining relative clause can change the meaning of the subject. Let's summarize this information. In a defining clause, the relative defines the subject, whereas in a non-defining clause, it only adds complementary information about the subject. Now, if you notice, in defining relative clauses, we don't use any kind of punctuation between the main clause and the relative clause. However, when the clause is non-defining, we have to separate the relative clause from the main clause by the use of commas. Now, there is another important difference between defining and non-defining clauses that concerns the use of who or which versus that in defining relative clauses. In a defining clause, the relative who or which can be replaced by that, and the only thing that happens is that it becomes more informal. For example, it is exactly the same thing to say the students who never studied will fail the course as saying the students that never studied will fail the course. The only difference is that who is more formal and that is more informal. Same thing happens if we say the students bought a book which was useless than if I say the students bought a book that was useless. So in both cases, we have defining relative clauses in which we can use which or who interchangeably with that. However, in non-defining relative clauses, you cannot use that. You can only use who or which. For example, the students who never studied will fail the course cannot be said the students that never studied. This is grammatically incorrect. You can never use that in a non-defining relative clause, and we can indicate, if you remember, that it's a non-defining relative clause because there is a comma, there are commas. Now, another example will be the students bought a book which was useless, but we cannot say the students bought a book that was useless. Okay? So this is ungrammatical. This is a non-defining relative clause, and we can only use the formal pronouns who or which. Now, why are non-defining relative clauses important in C1? They are important because in this level we can use them to add details or information to the things that we are saying. And secondly, because they can help us to make our formal or academic language more elaborate and complex. Some quantifying relatives that we can use in C1 are none of whom or none of which, few of whom or few of which, some of whom or some of which, many of whom, or many of which, and all of whom, are all of which. Now, some other relatives that we can use include the result of which, the cause of which, the consequence of which, the outcome of which. And finally, of course, we can use some of the common relative pronouns that we use in everyday language, such as who, or that, or which, or when, or where, or when, and why. Now, I want to conclude this presentation by giving you some examples of how non-defining relative clauses can help to make your discourse more elaborate, more complex, and more sophisticated. Here's the first example. Osama bin Laden, who masterminded the 9/11 terrorist attack, was hunted down and executed by the American government. So we can see how the non-defining relative clause that is embedded in the main sentence help us to elaborate and to provide more complexity and sophistication to our discourse. Second example, public transport muggers, some of whom carry firearms, are hardly ever arrested. Number 3, whistleblowers, all of whom denounce corruption, are usually persecuted by the government. And finally, El Chapo, who escaped from a Mexican prison through an underground tunnel, was sentenced to life imprisonment in the United States. So we can see that the parts white are the sentence, and the part that is embedded in the middle of the sentence is a relative clause that provides additional information and that makes our discourse more sophisticated and complex. Finally, we can say that some of the relative pronouns such as who and what and where and when can become subjects of the sentence if we add ever to them. So they become whoever, whatever, wherever, or whenever. We can see in these examples that I'm about to show you that they can become the subject of the main sentence. So we say whoever breaks the law will be punished accordingly. Number 2, whatever he said was useless. He had the word guilty written all over his face. Number 3, wherever there is impunity, there are high crime rates. And finally, whenever you want to come, you're more than welcome. We can see that in all of these cases, the relative pronoun becomes the main subject of the sentence. And that's what happens when we add ever to the relative pronoun. Well, according to Einstein, these are the relative clauses. Thanks a lot for your attention, and I will be seeing you next time.